Ken Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington presents World Focus, a continuing series on international political, social, economic, and cultural issues.
I'm Joe Butwin of the Department of English and the Jewish Studies Program in the Jackson School at the University of Washington. The Samuel and Althea Stroum Annual Lectures in Jewish Studies have been really the center of the Jewish Studies Program at the university since its beginning in 1975. Those lectures have included the work of such luminaries of Jewish thought as Irving Howe, Aaron Appelfeld, Yehuda Bauer. Many of the lectures have been published by the University of Washington Press, so that what we know of them in Seattle has really been spread throughout the world. Tonight, I'd like to introduce Ruth Wisse. Ruth Wisse is a professor of Jewish and American literature at McGill University in Montreal. Her subject for 3 lectures is the Yiddish writer I.L. Peretz, and her title for the 3 lectures, Creative Survival, The Making of Modern Jewish Culture. It's totally appropriate that Peretz should be put as a centerpiece of such a study. He, along with Shalom Aleichem, is really the main figure of Yiddish writing in Eastern Europe before the war. Any study of Peretz's work in that period is, in effect, what Professor Wisse has described it as, the center and indeed the origin, and for many the sad conclusion, of Jewish modern culture in Eastern Europe in this century. Thank you.
When Peretz began to write his memoirs, at the invitation of the periodical Yiddish Welt in 1913, he was then 61, he told his readers to expect a key to his works rather than to himself. Since he still intended to go on writing in the years remaining to him, the key would never quite fit all the locks. And since he intended to reveal only that part of the story that concerned his writings, his biographical revelations would be partial at best. There followed a series of impressions of his childhood and youth, beginning with the moments when his parents first recognized his intellectual gifts and tried to tailor an education to his special needs. First, he absorbed the influences of traditional Jewish society, and then he uncovered more and more of the world around him. The final stage of his transition from the halachic Jewish boy into the secular Jewish modern was the inevitable initiation into what Peretz calls their Beis Medrash, their house of study, when at 15 he began reading the texts of European civilization, including novels and modern history and philosophy and natural science, and the Napoleonic Code of Law, which he thought measured up very favorably to the Talmud. Bright and curious, excited by the world of knowledge that he had discovered, he eventually borrowed money from a sympathetic acquaintance and arranged for a driver to wait under his window before dawn, and prepared to set off to make his getaway for the university. But if the memoir is a key to Peretz's writing, the door that it opens at this point is virtually astonishing. The carriage is ordered. I pack in greatest secrecy. Earlier than usual, I pretend to go to bed, my sack under my pillow, knowing that I will not close my eyes. A whistle from the street is to be my signal. I put out the lamp and take my leave of everyone and everything in the dark house. My heart is not entirely easy, but I must. Lying there, I hear a soft rustling in the next room. I listen. My door softly opens. Quietly, in bare feet, my mother enters. I barely see her by the pale moonlight through the window. She moves softly toward the bed, sits down at the foot of it, looks at me with pain in her face. I cannot shut my eyes. I must see her and go on seeing her as the tears run softly from her eyes. She's saying goodbye to me. Who gave away my secret? But she is on guard over me. Her tears are on guard over me. I don't leave. So the most dynamic Jewish writer of his generation, the man credited with having single-handedly created a Jewish 19th century, the phrase is Jacob Gladstein's, presents himself in the story of his life as a youth who could not finally tear himself away from his mother's love. Peretz offers no further explanation for this decision to remain at home, nor any hint that several years later, under quite different circumstances, he did go on to study law. The silent exchange between mother and son serves as the climax of his autobiography, and the immediate consequence of his decision, his misguided first marriage to a young woman whom his father had chosen for him, with every reasonable expectation of his happiness, is merely the denouement, the unraveling of a plot that had already been resolved. Compared to the romance for which his reading and imagination had prepared him, this arranged marriage, which only lasted a few years, was a humiliation, and Peretz claims in his autobiography not even to have remembered in which town it actually took place. The decisive encounter of his memoirs is not between the young man and his bride, but the earlier one between the young man and his mother. Peretz invites us to recognize him as the forever loyal, or perhaps the forever captive, son. The fact is, Peretz really did stay home, and the emphasis of the memoir alerts us to a side of his character that his great fame otherwise tended to obscure. Opposing the ceaseless adventurism of his mind was a powerful centripetal force. After he became a lawyer, as I said in the first talk, he settled into practice in his native city, and had he not been deprived of his right to practice his profession, he probably would have continued to live there throughout his life. He talked of emigrating to Argentina in the early 1890s and of visiting Palestine in 1909, but he never seriously made the effort to go to either place. Instead, he stayed in the same job for 25 years and turned his Warsaw apartments, first on Ceglana Street and then on Jerozolimsky, into a literary home for all. Of the three giants of Yiddish literature, Sholem Aleichem and Mendele Moicher Sporim being the others, though he alone, Peretz alone, is considered the modern, he traveled the least, never visiting Western Europe until he was 51, and then only for a rest cure that had been prescribed for his health. Apparently, his readers complained of his lack of knowledge about the globe, because in one of his columns he apologized to them for the geographic mistakes they accused him of making. He writes, "Maybe I am guilty because actually I don't know geography, and that's why I never offer advice about where to go." His well-advertised and lifelong sensitivity to Litvaks, Lithuanian Jews, actually Jews who came to Warsaw from the east, suggests an aggressive provincialism that gives instinctive credit to those who most resemble the folks back home. Peretz's most unusual friendship with the writer Jacob Dinesen may also be considered in this light. Dinesen made no secret of his adoration of Peretz from the first moment that he met him in Warsaw in 1890 to the years after his death, when Dinesen asked for and received from the widow, the second wife, Helena Peretz, permission to be buried beside her husband in her stead. And in fact, of course, Ohel Peretz still stands in Warsaw, and sure enough, Dinesen is there beside Peretz. There was always much amused and tender speculation about this lonely bachelor who suspended his own literary career in order to be at the constant service of his superior colleague. But the other side of the friendship was no less desperate. When Dinesen left Warsaw in the early 1890s, Peretz begged him to return. He would welcome him as a bridegroom greets his bride. Dinesen without him, he wrote, was a zero, but he without Dinesen was a zero minus. The domestic language that the two men used between themselves was not unusual in Jewish literary circles. Shalom Aleichem and Mordechai Spector also addressed one another playfully as husband and wife. And if the modern mind immediately associates such usage with homosexuality, it is clear from their complete lack of self-consciousness that these Jewish writers did not. The friendship with Dinesen meant that Peretz had not only one motherly wife in Helena, who had no children of her own, but a second literary consort in Dinesen to encourage him constantly and to oversee the details of his literary career. As Peretz indicated, the scene between the adolescent son and his tearful mother is most revealing of literary influences and artistic direction. Peretz's enormous admiration for Gorky may have inspired him to recognize in his own life an indebtedness such as the Russian writer expressed to his mother. Beyond that, Peretz's hushed mother by moonlight conveys something of the legendary Mother Rachel, weeping for her children as they pass by her tomb into exile. Throughout his memoir, Peretz presents his mother, always shrouded in softness, as an earthly manifestation of the Shekhinah, the female emanation of God, who brings him spiritual grace while exacting from him a certain reciprocal responsibility. A powerful, passionate believer in the freedom of the human will, Peretz considered his decision not to leave home to be a determining moral choice, the choice that governed his entire life as a writer. In thus exposing the emotional roots of his intellectual life, Peretz was coming to terms with perhaps his deepest source of conflict. He'd always been afraid that his manhood could only be gained at the cost of destroying his home. In one of the first Yiddish stories he ever wrote, two boys in the study house debate the virtues of Western civilization as a choice between erotic and sublime love. Chaim discovers in the notebook of his fellow student Zelig the phrase, "And Hannah was as beautiful as Venus," and he wants to know what Venus means. Selig, who is here a spokesman for the Jewish Enlightenment, describes the tempestuous goddess of love and her role in Greek mythology, poking fun at Chaim's ignorance and ethnocentricity. But Chaim soon turns the tables when Selig suggests an analogy between Venus and Shulamith, the heroine of the Song of Songs. It's his turn to be indignant. How can Venus, this vengeful sinner who is a party to adultery and murder, be compared to Shulamith, whose love is eternal and stronger than death? Rivers cannot carry it off. The sea itself cannot extinguish it. Shulamith is so chaste that she regrets her shepherd lover is not her brother, born of the same parents, so that then she might kiss him openly and freely in public. Shulamith is simple, noble, incapable of deception, carried away by the splendor of Shulamith, who is also, of course, the representation of the Jewish people in love with its almighty God. Chaim refuses the comparison with Venus or with anyone else at all. The story ends with this challenge of Jewish innocence to worldly experience, at least for the moment. It will be hard for them, however, to cleave to the sublime and pure Shulamith when European culture, with all the irresistible properties of a bordello, is out there waiting. So the filial temper is the ascendancy of the son over the lover. And Peretz explored the indissoluble links of body and mind in facing this choice, much as D.H. Lawrence was to do some years later. He explored the connection between erotic freedom and creativity, not only as it affected the Jew or the artist, but humankind as a whole. At the same time as Venus and Shulamith, he published a light-hearted sketch about the Chelamer Melamed. The Chelm, you know, is the Jewish fool's town. The Melamed is the primary teacher. The Chelamer Melamed is the primary teacher, a very silly man of the fool's town of Chelm. But in this sketch, it's not so much his foolishness that is at stake. The Jews in the story of the Chelamer Melamed undertake to free the world from the Yetzer Hora, the evil impulse, which in Jewish usage corresponds to lust. They succeed in ensnaring the evil impulse, and then they burn him to a crisp and they scatter his ashes to the winds. Everything is fine and dandy, except that when people stop lusting for one another, no one is fruitful or multiplies. So the cycle of life might have ended had not a speck of the Yetzer Hara's ashes accidentally blown into the eye of the Chelem teacher, who was just then returning from a 7-year hibernation that he had undertaken in order to free himself of the evil impulse. Well, cured at last, he is about to re-enter civilization when the speck of lust dust reinfects him anew. The narrator, a Hasidic Jew, tells the story in the name of his own grandfather, who used to say, if it weren't for the Melamed of Chelm, we would have disappeared from the face of the earth long ago. So the erotic principle was for Peretz a necessary evil, and not, as it became for D.H. Lawrence, a liberating good. Yet lest we are tempted to draw overly facile conclusions about the connection between the creative spirit and the liberated libido, we might consider how Lawrence's vitalism hardened into ideology, into literary preachiness, and by contrast, how boyish Peretz remained in his creative experimentation to the very last moments of his life. One thing at least is certain about this writer who stood on the threshold of modern psychology. Peretz did not perceive his mother's tears as an obstacle to his freedom, but as part of the necessary price that one paid for civilization. By yielding to his mother's love, the more potent for remaining unvoiced, he accepted the burden of social responsibility, which was also his creative impulse in his literary and his private life. Of course, complicating the emotional attachment to his mother was the special danger to which Jewish civilization was exposed. To some extent, the threat of dissolution was common to all traditional or semi-traditional societies at the end of the 19th century, and every son who rebelled against his parents was upending much more than his family. In the Jewish case, however, the threat was compounded. Jews were not only subject to the same processes of urbanization, industrialization, and secularization that were revolutionizing all European peoples, they were being held responsible by many groups within Europe for the distress of modernity itself. Economically rooted as they were in towns and cities, politically marginal to and religiously suspect by the Christians, the Jews seemed to profit most by modern reforms and could thus be blamed for having fostered them. In such an atmosphere, the filial Jew had to assume responsibility not only for his beloved mother, but for a despised mother folk with its despised mother tongue. He could try to universalize this impulse, claiming to be the protector of all the oppressed, rather than of his particular people. But if he were an honest son, as Peretz was, he would have to acknowledge the failure of this strategy because, unfortunately, at the vanguard of Jew hatred were usually to be found the oppressed themselves, resisting the Jew's affection as strenuously as the Jew tried to embrace them. Now, the Jewish hero of Peretz's 1903 stories, which is called Stories, is a son who did not yield to his mother's tears, but left his shtetl to live among the Gentiles. As a struggling writer in Warsaw, he is so estranged from his Jewish home and the surrounding Jewish community that he doesn't even realize that the day of the story is the eve of Passover, until the cashier of a restaurant that he frequents makes a sour comment to him about their holiday. Only then does he realize the significance of the unusual activity that he noted in his rooming house that morning and in the bustling streets of Warsaw. The young writer is preoccupied with a Polish seamstress he had met in the park some weeks earlier, who is going to pay him a visit that very evening. This poor Goya has her own problems. After long days at the sewing machine, she has no one at home but a mother who beats her and abuses her. Illiterate and more than a little anti-Semitic, she tolerates the Jew's company because of the stories that he tells her. Fairy tales, they must be, according to her, fairy tales, and they must have a happy ending so that they should offer her momentary diversion from the troubles of her life. Though she finds him unattractive, she says, "You mustn't dare to touch me. I'm not interested in you. You're so ugly. If you touch me, I will scream and run away." Nevertheless, she allows herself to be entertained by him for the romantic illusions that he spins. In anticipation of amusing this seamstress and perhaps even winning a kiss from her, the writer spends the day plotting in his mind a complicated fairy tale about the search of a prince for a sleeping princess on a mountain. The story tells of many distractions that keep a man from his true purpose, and on a symbolic level, it could be interpreted as a myth about Poland's struggle for liberation, or an artist's attempt to capture a perfect work. I won't go into that story here. But the awareness of Passover intrudes on the young Jew's consciousness and provokes a stab of homesickness. During his first years in Warsaw, driven half crazy with loneliness, he had gone home for the holiday, and he tried to achieve a reconciliation with his mother and father. It lasted only a very brief period of time, until that part in the Seder service when the plagues are visited on the Egyptians. Disgusted with the aggressive nationalism or the religious particularism or whatever it was in this part of the story that came to represent for modernizing Jews the most reactionary part of their tradition, he balked, and it was all his mother could do to persuade him to stay at the table. But he left town on the third day of the holiday without even saying goodbye to his father, and since then he had not been home. His only contact with the past are the occasional letters from his mother and a recent parcel from her containing 4 pairs of knitted socks with the note, "Do be careful and keep your feet warm." Now, mounting the stairs to his room, he sees a vision of his mother with her back to him, blessing the candles, trembling and crying for him. Without quite knowing how it happens, he begins to invent stories of bygone Seders that were threatened by hostile intruders. In one such sequence, the police and soldiers bang on the door. The patriarch of the family, instantly alert, interrupts the Seder, orders his family to look under the table and to take from there the dead Christian child that has been hidden there by the pogromists, which is what the family then does. The head of the family orders them to cut up the body, which they do. He orders each person to put a piece on his plate and to eat it, which they do. And so when the attempted blood libel is thus thwarted, and the police are forced to leave empty-handed because by the time they come in there is no evidence at all, the assembled guests raise their voices in the Shvoy Chamoscho, the prayer that says, "Pour out your wrath on the nations that did not know you," the very expression of national aggressiveness that drove this young Jewish writer initially from his parents' home. Not surprisingly, he decides that this image that he has just created in his mind requires a stronger pen than his, and he tries a second, softer treatment of the same theme. We go back. At the same point that the child is discovered under the table, this time, the Baal Shem Tov, the miracle-working master of the good name, who is credited with being the founder of the Hasidic movement, who's come to spend this Seder as an uninvited guest, commands the murdered child to awake, and the child wakes, commands a robe to be brought for him and a yarmulke, a skull cap, which is brought, and he tells Yannick to sit down among them and to read the service with the Jews at the table. And so once again, when the pogromists break in the door, there is nothing to find. Apparently, this young Jewish writer, who was actually the one responsible for destroying his parents' Passover, projects his own destructive urges unto the even more destructive anti-Semites, and then in his stories invents patterns of rescue as an expression of his protective guilt. And so after all this, when the seamstress finally knocks at the door, asking whether he has any stories, he concludes the story by answering, all kinds. Trapped in the kind of masochistic love that Somerset Maugham described in Of Human Bondage, and that the actor Emil Jennings immortalized in the movie The Blue Angel, the Jewish writer in this story does not really complete any of the stories he begins to write, neither the Polish romances for the seamstress, nor the Jewish neo-folk tales for his mother. Here again, sexual attraction to a woman is identified with cultural attraction to the Poles and consequent betrayal of his mother. But the added twist of anti-Semitism raises the stakes of his choice. The prejudice of the seamstress appeals to him because he too longs to free himself of the Jewish burden, but it threatens the inheritance that he would keep. Even as he loves her hatred of him, he finds it hard to give up the love of his mother, his only guaranteed source of warmth and loyalty, and not to be frivolous of socks. Peretz, who seemed to know this conflict from the inside, presents it in this story from the outside, in a critical study of the man who will never satisfy either side of his divided self. Well, Peretz was not that man in the story, but the dichotomy that he sets up in the story between fairy tales with a happy ending to enchant despairing women and powerful national folk tales to protect threatened Jews provides a telling glimpse into his own artistic laboratory. At the same time that this story appeared, Peretz had begun to publish his Volkstimmliche Geschichten, a series of modern folk tales that may be said to combine the impulses of universal enchantment and national protection, or the desire to satisfy the seamstress's need for escape and the Jewish mother's unarticulated plea for continuity. Peretz reached into traditional sources, particularly to the published homiletic Jewish folk tales, for stories of hope, courage, love, and unbreakable faith that captured the moral essence of the Jews. These stories, the Volkstimmliche Geschichten, were instantly popular and probably remain the most popular of Peretz's works. Social reformers and political activists were prepared to overlook their neo-romantic flavor for the boost that they gave to national dignity and to social conscience. The seamstresses and the mothers enjoyed their momentary relief from material reality and from materialistic ideologies. The folk tales offer very fundamental reassurance about the moral order of the universe. In one story, some of you may know, in Turbin, it's called 7 Good Years. In Turbin, there was once a pious and a very poor Jewish Träger. The word is normally translated as porter, but it would be better understood as coolie. And this man had great difficulty providing his family with food for the Sabbath, and much more trouble providing them with food for the rest of the week. One particularly miserable Thursday afternoon, after he waited all day in vain for a customer to buy his service, a stranger appears in the market with a strange proposal. The stranger is empowered to grant the porter 7 good years, 7 years of plenty. The porter must only decide whether he wants the years immediately while he's still healthy enough to look for work, or later in old age when he might need them more. The good porter does not choose, but he goes home to consult with his wife. The wife is the principle of economic reality in Yiddish fiction, and Haskalah literature had poked merciless fun at uxorious husband. Here, however, where the appeal of the husband to his wife is made in the name of domestic harmony, each member of the family makes his decisions according to what is best for all the others. Concerned for the family's welfare, the wife asks for the money here and now, because God will provide for tomorrow, and in the meantime, the children have been sent home from Cheder because they have no tuition money. So the porter goes to the market to convey his wife's decision, and by the time he returns home, his children have discovered golden coins in the sand. In these modern folk tales of Peretz, though, the supernatural miracle is only the occasion for the human miracles that are manifest on earth. When the stranger returns 7 years later to tell the family that their years of plenty are over, the wife greets him with perfect equanimity. We never even began to enjoy our good years because we never considered the gold to be ours, she says. Only what a person earns with his 10 fingers is really his, and unearned treasures are no more than a trust fund for the poor. She explains that she took money only for charity and for her children's schooling because God might be expected to subsidize their study of his Torah. If God now found a trustier guardian for his treasure, let him by all means give it to someone else. At this point, the prophet Elijah, for of course it is he who comes as a stranger in all these tales, disappears to consult briefly with heaven, much as the porter did with his wife. All are agreed in heaven that the treasure should be left where it is, with the trustiest guardians that could be found. So the moral order of the universe is thus confirmed, not in heaven, but on earth. The Jews are by now so imbued with the spirit of God's Torah that if he will but grant them the bare subsistence for life, they can maintain his civilization without miracles. Elijah's arrival feels like a happy accident, but the moral heroism of the story lies in the porter's faith and in his wife's strict self-reliance. Now, all these stories offer similar solace. The presence of the supernatural assures us that there is a supreme moral order, but the actions and attitudes of earthly Jews go beyond its expectations. In another story, when the angels of good and evil come to accompany a couple of dying Jews to their proper places in heaven and hell, it turns out like this. The religious hypocrite who stole from the poor is exposed and taken to hell, where he belongs. But the man who did lifelong acts of charity, cheating just a little on Jewish ritual, is supposed to go to heaven, but chooses to go to hell, because there will be nothing for him to do in heaven. So while the Jewish moral universe guarantees us a standard of justice, the Jews themselves in this story aspire to an even higher standard of mercy. In these tales, the Jews also triumph, of course, over their Christian enemies. The wicked Polish nobleman may sport with his subject Jew, just as his licentious wife is always trying to lure the Jews into her bed. But Jewish morality invariably triumphs over Christian authority. Even when the Jew himself has to be killed in the process, his spirit prevails. Shin Ansky, the former Narodnik revolutionary who after many years of serving the cause of the Russian peasantry returned to Russia to study the culture of the Jewish folk, was very interested in the differences between Christian and Jewish folk traditions. Contrasting the physical hero of European folklore with the exclusively moral hero of Jewish folklore, Ansky proposes that the Jews have an unparalleled yearning for transcendent perfection. Ansky might well have been basing these theories on the neo-folk tales that Peretz was writing, which go much farther than anything he had previously written in emphasizing the supremacy of spirit over matter, and by implication, of the Jews to those who wielded power over him. To be sure, because these tales are set in a legendary past, there is no necessary connection between the malicious Polish landowners and the actual Poles whom Peretz and Ansky were coming into contact, with whom they were coming into contact. Contemporary Polish liberals were as opposed to the capricious villainy of the Polish nobility as were the liberal Jews. Nevertheless, implicit in Peretz's stories and explicit in Ansky's commentaries is an idea of Jewish moral supremacy that compensates for Jewish political inferiority. In another folk tale called The Three Gifts, the Jew with a knife at his throat dies for his treasured bit of Eretz Yisrael earth, which robbers mistake for his most valuable jewels. A Jewish woman condemned by Christians to death for violating their streets with her presence, asks to have her skirts pinned to her flesh as she is dragged by horses through the streets to her death so that she should not be violated by Christian eyes. And the Jew who is made to run the gauntlet goes back to retrieve his skull cap rather than to save his life bareheaded. Thus does he prove the superiority of his God over those whipping him. Note, however, that God's supremacy again and again is always proven by the Jew, not by God. This is Peretz's view of the Jewish moral strength that grew as opposed to the Christian political power, but it is also his view of the secular humanist faith as opposed to metaphysical religion. In the year before he began his Volkstimmliche Geschichten, Peretz wrote this, under the pseudonym The Bee, a weekly column called Cities and Towns, and you can tell from the pseudonym The Bee that it was meant to sting. He actually wrote this as a satiric column exposing all the wrongs that he saw, all the flaws that he saw in Jewish communal life in Poland. But in one column, he describes a visit from Bobby Yachne, a representative granny and really a very motherly kind of Jewish figure, who comes to chide him. She comes to express her anger with him for using the column to undermine traditional authority. Like all the Jews that he writes about, she too has fallen on very hard times. She explains to him that she had to pawn her jewelry and her headband to provide a dowry for her daughter and to buy an army exemption for her son, leaving her, as she says, as dry as a wet nurse that has been milked for too long. Peretz tries to explain to her that if he's picking on the rabbis, it is because the straying of the shepherd is more significant than the loss of one of his sheep. He justifies his profession of critic on the grounds that a guard must stand guard wherever he is placed. In other words, he says to her, though he takes no more pleasure in flaying the Jews than she does in reading his columns, he does his duty as he must. One has the feeling, as Bobby Yachne takes her leave after this conversation, that neither he nor she is very satisfied with their conversation. And in fact, the Volkstimmliche Geschichten, which he wrote immediately after these series of columns by the Bee, may be considered a more satisfactory response to Bobby Yachne's complaint. Here, rather than criticism, Peretz reaches for all that there may be to praise. In a sense, he may even be restoring to Granny some of her lost grandeur, not perhaps the pawned earrings and headband, but the proud spirit in which she once wore them. Abandoning realism altogether, and with it the need to stand guard over his contemporaries, he tries to do what religion once did, to remind the Jews of their divine mission and to rekindle their faith in their power to carry on that mission. He goes much farther than he did in the Hasidic tales, where he limited himself to the voice of a humble disciple, a mere witness to somebody else's greatness. Here, in these stories, he assumes the Rebbe's voice, the supreme storyteller of omniscient invention and knowledge. And this, perhaps, in the most beautiful of all these folk tales, really one of the most stunning folk tales, called Devotion Unto Death. It is to be found in the Howen Greenberg anthology, A Treasury of Yiddish Stories, if you're interested in reading it in English translation. It begins in the following way. There once dwelt in Sfat a Jew of great wealth and good fortune who traded in jewels, diamonds, and other precious stones. He was truly a man of great wealth, not like the upstarts of our day. This Jew lived in a palace of his own, with windows that shone like gleaming eyes upon the Sea of Galilee, and about his palace bloomed a magnificent garden with all manner of beautiful trees and fruits. Songbirds sang in the sky, and on the earth there grew aromatic herbs that were a joy to behold and of much use in healing. Wide paths strewn with golden sand wound through the garden, and over these paths, the crowns of the trees wove into one another to form a canopy of shade. Little arbors in which one could rest lay scattered along the edges of the garden, and in the ponds, which glistened like mirrors, there swam the rarest and whitest of swans. It was an earthly paradise. The most telling feature of this earthly paradise, Peretz's own Garden of Eden, is the leisurely narrative style, as if the impatient author had deliberately adopted a Sabbath pace to set this fiction apart from all his workaday prose and certainly all the rest of his fiction. And so too, every other element of the narrative is festive and opulent. Reb Chia, the owner and inhabitant of this paradise, is not rich in the manner of modern Jewish parvenus, but ideally rich in wisdom, learning, goodness, as well as in all imaginable earthly possessions. The Jewish world encompassed by this story is no dingy historical shtetl or threatened European community, but a time that never was, when great yeshivas flourished simultaneously in Jerusalem, Safed, and Babylon, and Jewish merchants traveled freely across all the deserts and seas. Like virtually all of Peretz's fiction, this story also turns on moral choices and moral disclosures, but within a context of grandeur, nobility, endless space and time. Mesiras Nefesh, the title of the story, means self-sacrifice, devotion unto death, fathomless love. Although Peretz had often written about love in Hebrew verse and realistic fiction, the love motif of this story was like the story itself on a much higher plane. Three intertwined romances weave through the main story to bind parental love, intellectual love, and erotic love with the theme of supreme sacrifice for love. And at the center of the story, of course, is a classical romance of a young man who must overcome his handicap before winning the hand of his beloved. The hero, Hananiah, is the perfect Jewish scholar, except for one fatal flaw that is encouraged by his mother and developed by his teacher. He allows himself to be tempted into casuistry, and instead of serving Torah as the repository of truth, he uses his cleverness as a weapon against the truth and against his fellow students. For this crime, he has to pay heavily. His knowledge is taken from him, he becomes amnesiac and forgets everything, and he is condemned to lonely exile in the desert. Only after a very lengthy penance is he readmitted into Jewish scholarly ranks to begin again as an analphabet. This time, stupid and humble, he is inspired to study for the sheer love of Torah in selfless devotion. But Mesiras Nefesh is more audacious than this. More tenacious and devoted than the scholar Hananiah is his bride, Miriam, Reb Chia's only daughter, who chooses this humble beggar over all the other scholars, attracted by his purity and his pain. She marries him knowing that the heavens are going to take him from her a week after their marriage as final payment for his sin. By that time, he will have recovered his great memory and his great gift for learning, but he will have to die nevertheless. He will be allowed redemption only through her and through his posthumous child. Well, one day in the garden, that same luscious garden to which we were introduced at the start of the story, Miriam overhears the snake making its plans to poison her husband. And at the appointed hour, dressed in her husband's clothes, she knows that a woman is not allowed to put on men's clothes. But since this is pikuach nefesh, this is a life is in the balance, she does it. She dresses in her husband's clothes and sets out to fool the snake. Undetected, she lets herself be bitten instead of her husband. She dies and rises to heaven, where her appearance causes great consternation. A mistake. Such things dare not happen. She must return immediately to life where she belongs. Miriam, however, does not intend her sacrifice to be in vain. Not until she extracts from heaven the promise that Hananiah will be spared does she agree to return to earth and consequently to have to undergo again at the end of her life the second death that awaits her. Well, fairy tales are replete with final reversals where all the bad are punished and the good rewarded. In these fairy tales, as we see, the miracles are wrought not by the supernatural powers, but by human beings who challenge heaven's justice, as Miriam does, with her superior standard of mercy. Miriam's devotion forces heaven to bend its laws and becomes the ultimate validation and source of Torah itself. If you notice, the story thus reverses the biblical text where Eve falls prey to the snake's temptation and invites Adam to share in her sin. Miriam outwits the snake, and in redeeming her husband, she also redeems Eve with her impure lust for knowledge. Miriam's love for her husband is protective as a mother's love for her son. Miriam is just such a hallowed Jewish mother as Peretz describes in his memoirs, and in placing her at the heroic center of his Jewish myth, he's ascribing to her the ultimate value from which all others flow. Intellectual prowess, the male realm, depends for its moral confidence on self-sacrificing love, which is the female realm. This is what Peretz, drawing upon his own experience, established as the hierarchy of Jewish values. I think Peretz is bound to elude anyone who tries to sum him up. He was in the habit, actually, of explaining his personal frustration through a story about a princess who takes great pleasure in wandering through a beautiful garden, except that whenever she tries to pick a flower or to pat an animal, whatever she touches turns to clay in her fingers. The same is true for this attempt to pick up the essence of Peretz. At every point, the vigorous intelligence of his writings and of his life beg for interpretation, but there is too much to contain, and every discrete piece feels lifeless when it's plucked away from the whole. The many warring aspects of his personality help to account for this. He was torn between law and literature, Hebrew and Yiddish, marriage and adultery, Poland and the Jews. There didn't seem to be enough pseudonyms to contain all the voices that he was ready to assume. The progressive Dr. Stitzer, who supported modern education, the bee that spares no one its sting, the orphan of Nemirov, a study in Jewish pathos, the editorial letz, or fool, who cannot find the proper literary tone, Israel Schwermut, the Jew of heavy heart, Lucifer, the devil himself, and many, many more. His stylistic trademark were the 3 run-on dots that said, "No time to finish," or "Figure it out for yourself," or "I'm trying to avoid the censor," or "To be continued." With this suggestiveness, this tolerance of incompletion, Peretz wanted to stimulate the creative imagination of his readers instead of spooning out little teachings like the elementary teacher. Many of his elliptical stories and essays, difficult enough at the time, are today virtually incomprehensible without extensive commentary and notes, as we said. Peretz was the first genuinely introspective modern in Yiddish literature, digging about into the subconscious, mixing day and night to achieve a truer picture of the human condition. Yet begin to describe the author in this impressionistic manner, and we come up against his doppelganger, an inverted other self, the man who did not merely put in his regular time at the Warsaw Jewish Gemina, but tried to raise the public role to its noblest artistic height. The passionate educator, translator, clarifier, he wanted to fashion a Jewish people with cultural resources deep and meaningful enough to make up for all its social humiliation and political plight. When World War I broke out and Jewish refugees from the occupied border towns began to flood Warsaw, Peretz drove himself to a frenzy, supervising soup kitchens and the Jewish orphanage that he had helped to found. His last unfinished lines, found on his death when he died, just on his desk when he died, belonged to a series of children's poems that he was then writing, simple and clear as a bell, and the words that he left were, Stiller, stiller, danken will er. Hush and hush, he wants to give thanks. And this too was Peretz, whom an estimated 100,000 Jews, including representatives of every ideological and organizational faction, accompanied to burial during Cholamoid Pesach 1915, 73 years ago. And most of all, Peretz's hopes and fears depended on the outside world, specifically on his Polish compatriots and on the Tsarist regime to which they were both subject. It was on this front that Peretz had always waged his most complicated campaigns against assimilation on the one hand and for integration into Poland on the other. His idea of the modern folk or the modern nation was theoretically ideal for the Polish context, since the Jews and Poles had shared the same soil for hundreds of years, and during the national uprising of 1863 had even demonstrated their common opposition to the same political oppressor. If each people could now continue to draw from its distinct religious heritage in forging a modern national identity in its own national language, they could express their creative autonomy side by side. Peretz never faltered in his filial support for the Jews and saved his most scathing polemics for Jews who traded in their identity through religious or cultural conversion. Much less noted by Peretz scholars and biographers was his equally fierce loyalty to Mother Poland and his resistance to any geographic or political alternative to local coexistence. And it is here that Peretz suffered his most crippling disappointment. We are always dependent on the non-Jewish will, he wrote soberly in 1912, following a fiercely contested election over local representation to the Russian parliament. However partial and unsatisfactory the Tsar's introduction of parliamentary procedures in governing the country, it at least pointed in the right direction, and Jews like Peretz felt that if the progressive Jews and Poles could only consolidate their efforts, they could build up a strong basis for the democratic, autonomous Poland of the future. The election campaign destroyed the last vestige of these hopes. Instead of the required Polish-Jewish cooperation in their struggle against Russian rule, the Jews encountered a new and unprecedented form of Polish anti-Semitism as an instrument of modern nationalism. The professed Polish nationalists made anti-Semitism the main plank of their election platform, promising to put the Jews in their proper place, and even former liberals, good Poles who had once expressed tolerance for the Jews in their midst, now adopted anti-Semitic slogans in projecting their own views of the Polonized future. The prophecy that Peretz had so recently prophesied at the Czernowitz conference about the decline of the state and the rise of enfranchised national minorities in a multinational Europe was proved utterly mistaken in his own city. Never one to deny reality, Peretz looked his hopes squarely in the face. Alexander Świętochowski had been one of the leading voices of Warsaw positivism in the 1880s, and he had been one of Peretz's great mentors and models. When, as the model of tolerance, he said that all Poles could work together for the future of Poland, and that included the Jews in their midst. That tolerance, as Peretz had come to realize, had been contingent on Świętochowski's idea that the Jews would assimilate. The public Peretz fought the harder, the more he was opposed. If the Poles were prepared to accept them as allies, the Jews would join them, he said. As long as the Poles pressed for their dissolution, the Jews would stiffen their Jewishness. In one of his columns, he offered the following parable. Once upon a time, in ancient Greece, the city of Sparta was under siege. Realizing that they could no longer hold out against the enemy, the community elders sent to Athens for reinforcements. Instead of the expected troops and weapons, Athens sent only a single man, the hunchback Pindar. But this single man was enough to turn the tide of battle. Standing in the public square, Pindar the poet sang such a hymn to battle that he fired young and old with the courage and patriotic love to defeat the enemy. Peretz Pindar determined to do the same for his besieged people. As the modern folk evolved from the ancient religious community, culture would have to take over from religion and poets from preachers and rabbis in keeping the Jewish moral spirit alive and strong. If they did the job well enough, the people would prevail. Well, on the 25th anniversary of the death of Peretz, Greening Kebemalach, the Yiddish school publication of Vilna, put out a special volume of Yud Lamed Peretz for youth. It opened with Peretz's parable about Pindar's rescue of Sparta that the editors had excerpted from the newspaper article in which it originally appeared and published in large letters under the title Der Singer, der Sieger, the poet, the victor. With this story, the educators of Vilna obviously hoped to inspire and to encourage their students. The year was 1940, sometime after the Russians had turned the city over to the Lithuanians and just before it was taken by the Germans. The problem with the parable is there in the text itself. Sparta had a polity and an armed force to which Pindar could appeal, and the school children of Vilna did not. And contrary to Peretz's expectations, the state, rather than the folk or nation, turned out to be the dominant unit of the 20th century, consolidating a will to power such as he could never have imagined. More than any Jewish writer of his time, Peretz shaped and inspired the development of a modern Jewish culture. Before his death, he sensed and gave voice to his fear that while cultural vitality could keep a people spiritually alive, cultural politics were futile in protecting the people themselves. It was one thing to insist, as he had done, on spiritual resources as a necessary corrective to materialist reductionism. He, however, had slipped into the opposite trap of spiritual inflationism, sentimentalizing culture as an alternative to political power. The school children of Vilna and Warsaw, along with their teachers, were slaughtered with the words of Peretz on their lips.